It was Christmas Eve, 1914. The Western Front stretched for nearly 500 miles across Belgium and France, a torn seam of mud, wire, and silence. In the trenches, men who had been killing each other for months sat just meters apart in the freezing dark. And then, from somewhere across no man's land, that narrow strip of earth between the opposing lines, a light appeared. Then another. Then another. They were Christmas trees. The German soldiers had placed small candles along the parapets of their trenches. They were singing. The British soldiers on the other side could hear it clearly through the cold air. Stille Nacht. Silent night. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of modern warfare, and one that the armies on both sides tried, for years, to pretend had never happened. How does a war pause for Christmas? To understand the truce, it helps to understand how the war had already shattered every expectation held by the men fighting it. In August 1914, soldiers on both sides had marched off to what their governments promised would be a short, glorious campaign. Historians like John Keegan, whose landmark work, The Face of Battle, documented the psychological reality of industrialized warfare, have shown that by December of that first year, most men in the trenches understood they had been lied to. The war was not going to be over by Christmas. It was going to be long, cold, and merciless. The Western Front, the name given to the main battleground running from the English Channel down through Belgium and into northeastern France, had by late 1914 already become a system of elaborate defensive trenches. The trench was not a single ditch. It was a network of connected channels, reinforced with timber and sandbags, designed to allow soldiers to move and shelter under fire. The frontline trench faced the enemy. Behind it were support trenches. Behind those, reserve trenches. Between the German lines and the Allied lines lay no man's land, sometimes as little as 30 meters wide, sometimes several hundred, strewn with barbed wire, shell craters, and the dead. The men living in these trenches were rotated in and out, but during their time in the line, their existence was defined by cold, mud, rats, lice, the smell of rot, and the constant awareness that a sniper's bullet or a mortar shell could arrive at any second. They could not stand up fully without risk of death. They ate, slept, and waited in cramped conditions that broke down the distance between strangers quickly. A man's life often depended on the soldier next to him. Bonds formed fast. By December 1914, something unexpected had already begun to emerge along certain sections of the line. Informal agreements, not peace treaties, not orders from above, just quiet understandings between exhausted men. Historian Malcolm Brown, who along with Shirley Seaton compiled one of the most thorough documentary accounts of the Christmas Truce, found letters and diaries showing that soldiers on both sides had begun to observe informal ceasefire periods around mealtimes or to avoid firing at men who stepped out simply to relieve themselves. The shared misery of the trenches had, in some sections, quietly eroded the hatred. Then came December 24th. The accounts from that night come from dozens of surviving letters and diaries, many of them collected in the Imperial War Museum in London. Private Albert Moren of the 2nd Queen's Regiment wrote home that the German trenches opposite them began to be illuminated with small Christmas trees. Sergeant Bernard Brooks of the Scots Guards described hearing voices calling out in accented English from across no man's land. "Come over, we not shoot." Captain Sir Edward Hulse, writing in a letter later published in the British press, described how a German officer approached the British wire under a white flag just after midnight, requesting a brief ceasefire to bury their dead. The officers on both sides were in an impossible position. Fraternizing with the enemy was, technically, a court-martial offense. The orders from high command on both sides were unambiguous. The war was to continue without interruption. And yet, along stretches of the front, particularly in Flanders, the flat, waterlogged region of Belgium, where British and German troops faced each other across especially narrow gaps, the men had already made up their own minds. By Christmas morning, soldiers were climbing out of their trenches. What followed was documented in real time by the men who lived it. They shook hands, they exchanged cigarettes, buttons, and tins of food. A German soldier who had worked as a barber in London before the war offered to cut hair. A British soldier produced a football, or in some accounts, a tin can that served the same purpose, and a match was played in no man's land itself, between men who had been trying to kill each other the day before. The German side won. The score, recorded in at least one diary, was 3-2. They also buried their dead side by side in the frozen ground between the trenches. It is important to understand what this moment was not. It was not universal. The Christmas Truce of 1914 did not halt the entire Western Front. In many sectors, the fighting continued without pause. Artillery exchanges, sniper fire, raids, all of it went on. The truce was local, fragile, and uneven. Some units on both sides refused to participate. Some officers on both sides ordered their men back into the trenches and resumed firing within hours. At the higher command levels, the generals directing the war from chateau and headquarters far behind the lines, the truce was viewed not as a miracle, but as a security problem. Field Marshal Sir John French, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, issued orders the following year that no such fraternization would be tolerated. The German High Command did the same. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was, in the end, a single and essentially unrepeatable event. In 1915, 1916, 1917, and 1918, there were only isolated, much smaller incidents. The machinery of industrialized warfare had learned how to prevent human decency from interfering with its operations. But that does not diminish what happened. The men who participated understood they were doing something that broke every official rule of the war they were fighting, and they did it anyway. Not because they had stopped being soldiers, not because they were cowards or traitors, but because in the act of standing face to face with the man you had been ordered to kill, something older than any order asserted itself. A German soldier named Kurt Zemmisch, a Saxon infantryman who kept a diary throughout the war, wrote of that Christmas morning. How marvelously wonderful, yet how strange it was. He described exchanging addresses with British soldiers who promised to visit after the war. Some of them may have killed each other before the year was out. That is the truth the Christmas Truce forces us to hold. It is not a comfortable story. It is not a story about peace breaking out. It is a story about what human beings are capable of, even inside a war, even for a single morning, and about how quickly the conditions of organized violence can seal that possibility shut again. The counterintuitive fact that historians have continued to grapple with is this: the truce did not come from the top down. No general ordered it. No government permitted it. It came entirely from the men in the mud, the ones with the least power and the most to lose, who decided for one night and one morning that the war could wait. Today, the Christmas Truce is commemorated in several ways. In the Belgian village of Ploegsteert, known to British soldiers as Plug Street, there is a memorial specifically dedicated to the events of December 1914. The Peace Village Memorial near Messines, Belgium, was opened in 2014 on the centenary of the truce, funded in part by the governments of both Germany and Britain. Every year, descendants of men who participated in the truce gather at these sites. Some of them carry letters their great-grandfathers wrote home that Christmas morning. Letters that sound, in places, almost impossible to believe. It was Christmas Eve, 1914. The lights came on in the German trenches, and the singing began. And for a few hours, the Western Front held its breath. The men who stepped out into no man's land that morning were not heroes in any official sense. They were not celebrated. Some of them were reprimanded. But they had done something that no government on earth had managed in 4 months of catastrophic war. They had stopped it, briefly, imperfectly, unofficially, and completely on their own.